Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. Today I want to talk about the concept of extended adolescence, this recent phenomenon of why people are taking so long to grow up, what's kind of influencing that and the effect it has on society, and kind of the history of adolescence in and of itself. I'm also going to spend some time talking about the most common theme throughout literature, which is loss of innocence, and how this relates to the transition between childhood and adulthood. And I'm going to be touching on a lot of topics in this video, so as always I leave timestamps down below. But to begin, I'm going to start with the history of adolescence and the creation of the teenager because it's very recent. And so with that being said, I'm just going to get into the video. So our modern day concepts of childhood and adolescence are very recent. As we all know, child labor existed for a very long time. I mean, it still exists, but especially after the Industrial Revolution, it was huge. Children often worked 60 hours plus, starting from the age of like 3 or 4. And while schools existed, most kids, especially the ones who were not affluent, were just forced into the factories with everyone else. When the Great Depression hit, a lot of focus was taken away from child labor and back onto getting adults jobs. Most of the unemployed were between the ages of 18 and 24, but it took until 1938 for child labor to be totally abolished here in America. And when that happened, a lot more emphasis was placed on compulsory schooling, which was segregated by age. So instead of being in the factories with other kids and women and adults, children instead were in school for most of the day with other kids their age. And naturally, when you put a group of people together and have them spend all that time together, cultures emerge. And then after World War II, there was an economic boom, which kind of proliferated youth culture. They were number one, a new market to sell to, and then number two, they had more disposable income and more independence than they had before during the Great Depression and the war. And in 1945, the term teenager first entered public consciousness with the Teenage Bill of Rights, which was a 10-point charter, with the first demand being the right to let childhood be forgotten. It ultimately called on adults to respect the autonomy and individuality of adolescents. And so with that, teenagers were seen as separate from children, and they were also seen as separate from adults. But basically, the main shtick of what teenagers wanted was to be treated like adults, but with a little bit more lenience. They called for things like being able to date, being able to have rules explained to them rather than just strictly imposed on them, and so on. And so basically, that's a brief history of adolescence in America, a very short form version. But the first topic I want to tackle when it comes to how we shifted from adolescents mostly wanting independence to what we see now of like 20-year-olds pretending like they're still teenagers has to do with a shift in parenting styles. In the 1950s, even though pretty much every mother was a stay-at-home mom, they actually spent less time with each child than working mothers and working parents do now. In general, kids were allowed to roam about freely, hang out with each other, leave the house, come back at dark, so on and so forth. When it comes to Gen X, we also have the latchkey kid phenomenon, where increasing rates of divorce and more dual income families led to a lot of children being left alone, coming in from school by themselves and hanging out by themselves, going out with their friends by themselves, basically spending not a lot of time with their parents. And I'm sure there's a lot of criticisms that can be made about the whole latchkey generation, but in general, kids were set about to resolve conflicts between each other on their own. They were able to gain more independence because they spent time alone. And the shift into becoming an adult was a lot more gradual, with independence kind of just building up over time. But in recent years, most specifically with millennials and especially Gen Z, we see the rise of things such as helicopter parenting, where kids basically have no time to themselves or just with other kids. There's always a parent nearby, tracking your location on your phone, following you on social media, asking where you are at all times and what you're doing, and basically just less unsupervised time overall, and a lot more smothering and other aspects that come with this. And I think the rise of helicopter parenting is multifaceted, of course. I think, maybe the latchkey kids wanted to kind of go to the other extreme when it came to raising their own kids. Maybe in the post 9/11 world with this increase on safety and fear, parents are just afraid to let their kids go out. In the 1970s too, there was a wave of media attention on child abductions, the milk cartons with missing children on them, news reports, all of that. And even though child abductions are very rare today, I mean, they were rare back then, but like even more rare now, that sort of paranoia has kind of stuck with parents. And there are also general changes to the family structure. People are waiting until much later to have kids. They're having less children, which means a lot more time spent on each child. And like I said earlier, parents spend more time with their kids today than they ever have throughout history. And overall, I think this really leads to a lack of autonomy and independence when it comes to children. It makes the transition into adulthood a lot less gradual. If you're a parent and your kid goes and scrapes their knee, the first time, yeah, maybe they'll come to you crying and you put a Band-Aid on and clean it off or whatever. But the next time that they scrape their knee, they should be able to do that themselves. But when you're just constantly supervising your child, you're just doing that for them every single time. And that's basically the most watered down, like banal example I could think of. but you could see how this expands broader. For instance, in the schoolyard or on the playground, if one kid, calls the other kid a name, instead of those kids just resolving it and working it out, the kid comes running over to the teacher and tattles on the other kid, and then the teacher punishes the kid. And basically this leads to the phenomenon of moral dependence that we see a lot, which is basically relying on parents and later on bureaucrats to solve all your problems for you, and this ultimately kind of breaks down your own sense of autonomy and makes you less likely to believe in your own abilities to resolve conflict. An important part of being a kid and going out and exploring and playing and roughhousing a little bit is the fact that we need physical and mental stressors, otherwise we just deteriorate. And the increase on safety and overprotectiveness is actually doing a lot of damage. And some parents are so over-involved in their kids' lives that they'll basically call the teacher if their kid has a bad grade and complain, monitor the kids' grades all the time, write college application for children, and basically just try to micromanage their kids in any sense possible. And unfortunately, this trend of parenting has been reinforced in some places by law, which is really alarming. I'm going to read a little quote from Coddling of the American Mind that has to do with this. Good parents are expected to believe that their children are in danger every moment they are unsupervised. It gets worse. Parents who reject overparenting and give their kids more freedom can actually be arrested. In 2015, 2 Florida parents were charged with felony child neglect when they were delayed getting home. Unable to get into his house, their 11-year-old son played with a basketball in their yard for 90 minutes. A neighbor called the police. After being handcuffed, strip-searched, fingerprinted, and held overnight in jail, the parents were arrested for negligence, and the boy and his 4-year-old brother, who had not been left alone, were put in foster care for a month. Even after being returned to their parents, the children were required to attend play therapy. The parents, who had no history of neglecting their children, were mandated to get therapy and take parenting classes. And then later on it states, when the police endorse safetyism, it forces parents to overprotect. And I feel like I shouldn't have to explain why that's totally insane. I mean, when I was a kid, at least, I could just bike around wherever, hang out all day with my friends. My parents are both baby boomers, so I didn't really get the whole helicopter parenting experience. And there also used to be a time not so long ago where if you were 11 years old, you could babysit other people's kids. But nowadays, a lot of people hire babysitters for their 11-year-olds. In my opinion, children should be able to go to the store by themselves and buy things by themselves, bike around with their friends all day, hang out and explore, get into fights with each other here and then. To me, that's like a natural part of childhood and growing up. And I know it's annoying when someone talks about younger people, but I feel very fortunate that I grew up before the smartphone and I still got to have that classic childhood experience before this was so stigmatized. I'm also lucky that my parents are baby boomers because, like I said, I remember being in high school when the iPhones did come out and everyone had to share their location with their parents. Not everyone, but some people. And I just thought that was the most bizarre and crazy thing in the world. I think that's absolutely horrible. You should have independence and autonomy, especially as a teenager, but also as a child. It's just a natural part of growing up and gaining autonomy. And thankfully, there has been some response to this. In 2018, Utah passed a free-range parenting law that states that parents won't be considered negligent by authorities who cannot start an investigation if a parent lets their child walk outside alone, play without supervision, or allows them to wait in the car without an adult. And I feel like it's absolutely insane how quickly things have changed from the whole latchkey generation to now. It's like a total 180. And it's really depressing that that even has to be a bill, that has to be a law. And then another parenting style that bothered me growing up amongst my peers was the best friend parent. And those are parents who tell their children that their children are their friends or their best friends, which I think is an absolutely terrible thing to do to a child. A friendship is a two-way street. You need to talk about your emotions and get support. Your friend is there to listen and help you, and then when they feel the same way, you help them. It's not a two-way street when it comes to a child and a parent. A child and a parent can't be friends like that. A kid should not be responsible for your emotional issues or things going on in your life. I think it's especially bad when this happens amongst divorced parents and parents just shit on their partner to the kid and just start talking about issues that they're having with the kid's father. Your kid does not need to hear that. Why are you doing that? But when you treat your child like your friend and you rely on them for emotional support, it creates this codependence relationship that kid is probably going to carry on into future friendships and relationships where they feel like they have to be the caretaker in all situations. If you're a parent, you have to set rules for your kid. You have to discipline your kid. It's a different relationship than a friendship. I can't imagine how much more anxious of a person I would have been if I had a parent who was just constantly emotionally confiding in me and treating me as an equal instead of as a child. And this might not have to do with extended adolescence, this whole best friend parent thing, but I just wanted to get it off my chest. I think ultimately it kind of robs adolescents from kids because you're not treating them like a child. And it's fine to be friends with your parents when you're an adult. If you're an independent adult, yes, you can have a friendship with your parent if you have like a really cool parent. But the expectation that you need your kids to like you or be your friend while they're children is just crazy. And I am going to be talking about the class differences of middle and upper class parenting and lower and working class parenting, because there's a huge difference and it plays a large role in extended adolescence. But I'm going to get to that in the economics section after the university section, because it kind of ties it all in together. And so with that being said, we're going to move on to university. So in this section, I want to talk about two conceptions around university that have to do with extended adolescence. The first one is very easy to dissect. It's basically the pop culture view of university as being a place to just party and drink and shirk all responsibilities and sleep around and just kind of a cocoon before entering the real world. And there are obviously class implications to this. The general idea around this pop culture view is that people in college don't have to work. Most movies that focus around the partying aspect of college were generally filmed back when tuition prices weren't as insane as they are now. But there definitely is a pop culture view of university as a place of just extended adolescence in its purest form. Basically just high school with less adult supervision and more access to alcohol. But that aside, there is a real world kind of view of university that we've seen in recent years alongside the rise of extended adolescence, and that has to do with politics on campus. Starting around 10 years ago, professors have first of all noticed an increase in parents asking about their children's grades, which is crazy because obviously college professors can't share their students' grades. That's like against the law. But the fact that an adult would be involved in their college-aged child's life is also just completely insane. And this again has to do with helicopter parenting and all of that. But what we also see an increase in is students demanding their own overprotection. And I know it's very controversial to be against trigger warnings and all of that. Personally, I don't have anything against it. If you feel comfortable putting those on your videos or your texts or whatever, that's up to you. But I do think the increase, or basically the invention of trigger warnings in recent years is very interesting, because alongside this is a lot of students saying that certain books are harmful or dangerous because it makes them feel unsafe. And a result of this helicopter parenting and overparenting is the false idea that feeling unsafe means you are unsafe, or that uncomfortable things should be avoided. And this is especially concerning on college campuses because literally the point of education is to grapple with things that are uncomfortable and controversial, to be able to formulate arguments based on reason for what you believe in, and be able to engage with opposite forms of thought rationally and humanistically without getting really upset. But instead we see an increase of people just calling books that the teachers assigned problematic or harmful and just dismissing them and hoping not to have to engage in them. And one of the most bizarre aspects of this is the fact that it's the students advocating for censorship and banning of books and all of that, when normally it's the other way around. Usually it's some kind of authority that doesn't like the subject matter or context of certain books. You know, the People's History of the United States was banned. Certain books have been banned in high schools because of too much sexual content or adult content. And pretty much throughout history, the people who burn books or censor books have always been the bad guys. And in general, students used to advocate for free speech, even with ideas that they don't believe in or like. Most Americans and historically students have given a shit about the First Amendment and have given a shit about hearing different opinions on things in order to better their own arguments and expand their worldview. But instead we have students claiming that they're unsafe if certain speakers come to campus and so on and so forth, and basically just advocating for their own overprotection and coddling. And listen, if you have some kind of PTSD or something and you appreciate trigger warnings, you know, that's fine. But also if you have an issue that is that serious that just the mention of some kind of controversial topic will get you going, maybe you should go to therapy. Maybe you're not ready for the real world. I don't know. People are gonna get mad at me for saying that, but in general, you know, censoring yourself from uncomfortable things is gonna make you more anxious and less capable as a human being. All forms of therapy recommend grappling with the things that have traumatized you, or things that you're afraid of, or things that make you anxious in increments in order to eventually overcome it and live a normal, productive life. There's no form of therapy that just recommends closing yourself off to anything that may trigger you. That's literally the opposite of what therapy is for. And when it comes to education, like I said, the whole point is to grapple with uncomfortable topics and difficult topics, and to be able to talk to other people about it and really just wrestle with it and form your own opinions and arguments and so on. But this expectation for the world to just bend to your will because something makes you uncomfortable is ridiculous. And again, it's something we've only seen in recent years. And I think it has to do with, like I said, parenting styles and some other societal factors. One of those factors being the fact that university higher-ups are often cowards themselves, and they just let these kids do these tantrums and just bend to whatever they're saying regardless of how ridiculous it is. There have been university administrators who literally fire teachers over baseless claims or just ridiculous assertions. I mean, it's basically Twitter mobs in real life on certain college campuses. And the fact that a lot of school administrators just let the mob do its mob thing without any repercussion, to me, is very alarming. But on the other hand, I understand the entitlement of students who act in this way because they are paying tens of thousands of dollars to attend university. They probably do feel like customers, and the whole customer is always right thing reigns supreme in universities as well. And this, of course, isn't something that's seen on all college campuses. It's mainly just seen on really politically undiverse campuses that are very orthodox in terms of having large amount of students or faculty that only lean on one side, rather than having both conservatives and leftists on the same campus, which a university should have. But when you have a university that's politically orthodox or hegemonic, it can spiral into some really crazy ideas. And obviously I could spend an entire video, and I'm sure I will, on all the crazy aspects of extreme leftists and extreme rightists. But for the sake of this video, extended adolescence, I just want to focus on the fact that being afraid to push back on insane ideas, or really even sane ideas, literally any ideas, is really harmful. The whole point of education and university and politics even is to be able to have open discourse about any topic, no matter how uncomfortable or scary or whatever. University should be a place to learn how not to get offended, to be a place where you learn how to take criticism, how to rationally present your views, how to have peer review and research, all of that kind of thing. It's not a place to just throw a temper tantrum and have that be accepted. Something I've noticed a lot in recent years as well are people who literally start crying in the middle of debates or arguments, which is just honestly extremely embarrassing. And I'm gonna be honest, you guys, like, I've done it before too, mostly when I was younger. You get in a heated debate about something you're passionate about. Somebody's, presenting an argument and you can't make the right argument back, so you start getting emotional because it's something that's important to you. Yeah, I've experienced that before, I'm not gonna lie, but in general, when you're in a debate with someone and that happens, it's extremely embarrassing and childish. No sane person would ever take someone seriously in an argument or a debate if that person just breaks down in tears when you say something they don't agree with. But unfortunately, that's something that I see a lot personally. I don't know about you guys. And this is not me saying like, oh, you start bullying someone about something that they believe in just to bully them and then they get upset. That's one thing. I'm talking about having a regular, rational conversation or discourse around a topic and having the other person have a meltdown because they can't accurately argue their own viewpoints. And like I said, normally people do not take these types of people seriously, but now this has been overtly encouraged to where Twitter mobs and cancel culture basically reign supreme. The New York Times will literally fire someone because a Twitter mob is after them, regardless of if the person did anything wrong or not. There's a huge epidemic of cowardice along all aspects of authority. And listen, I'm not particularly horny for authority or anything like that. In general, I'm pretty skeptical of anyone in any position of power. I think everyone should be. But when you have a total breakdown of authority and you let, children run supreme, yeah, temper tantrums and stuff come about. This whole university safe space type of lashing out at everything, calling everything racist, transphobic, no matter what. Those type of tantrums literally remind me of like a kid whose parents say, no, you can't have that toy, you have a toy at home, and the kid just freaks out, and the parents just bend to the kid's will and buy him like a toy or whatever. It's like the more you give in to these outlandish, emotional, and sometimes aggressive and violent responses by people, the more that you encourage it. And personally, I don't want to live in a society that is just dictated by rage, where if someone's enraged about something, even if they're completely wrong to be enraged in that thing, that they get free reign to just attack people, or burn down buildings, or prevent speakers from coming on campus, or advocating for censorship both in their own experience and for other people. That's personally not a world that I want to live in. If you want to live in that world, let me know down below. And again, I know the majority of universities aren't like that. I went to a very liberal university and it wasn't fully like that, although there were definitely cases of that happening. I remember being in a college lecture and the kids were asking for trigger warnings for, the movies that they were going to be shown, and the teacher was like, well, there's a syllabus with all the films on it. If you have some kind of issue that you need a trigger warning, you could look up the synopsis for every film and just don't come if you don't feel like you could handle it. And then the classroom got really mad at her for not respecting trigger warnings, and I've never seen a mob of people that angry before. I remember looking at the classmates around me just yelling at this teacher, and I was like, wow, this is literally Twitter in real life. Like, that's the thought that I had. I was like, this is Twitter in real life. And the whole time she was just trying to have a dialogue about it, like, oh, like, trying to understand what trigger warnings were because she's like in her late 60s and this is a very recent thing. But instead of explaining it to her rationally, the students were just berating her over and over again for not understanding. And the fact that instead of having discourse, people just devolve into anger and like rage is extremely alarming to me. And it's something we see constantly because our world is so politically polarized. Again, this is something I'm going to go into in much more detail in future videos, but I've already spent too much time on it on this video because there's a lot I want to get to. But basically, engaging in these childlike behaviors of throwing a tantrum, of thinking in black and white, of letting emotions rule over reason is definitely having an effect on extended adolescence. Allowing students to overprotect themselves and censor things that they don't like is ultimately harming them. Grappling with things that make you uncomfortable and learning to exist with things that are uncomfortable is a part of growing up and being a competent adult. And the fact that we stifle this in our students and in our young adults is just extremely alarming to me. But what can we expect from a society that doesn't allow the gradual progression of childhood into adulthood anymore? I mean, people in high school, if you're 18 and you're in high school, you literally have to ask to use the bathroom, even though you're old enough to sign up for the military and kill people. And even though you have to ask to use the bathroom when you're 18 years of age, you also have to decide what you want to do with the rest of your life in terms of what you're going to study in college. There's absolutely no gradual process of becoming an adult. You're just treated like a child until all of a sudden you aren't, and then you're expected to be completely competent, even though we've completely created a society that works against that. Also, an issue that I don't think is going to change in schools, but I think is worth bringing up, is the whole stratification by age thing. There obviously has to be some way to sort out students and decide which students take which classes. But I think in general, having a society that's so segregated by age is ultimately harmful and not very effective. I think it's extremely useful to have friends who are both older and younger than you, because you learn from the older ones and you help teach the younger ones. And honestly, you can learn a lot from the younger ones as well. In general, a more mingling of ages I think would do a lot more good in terms of helping people gradually become adults, and will also help lessen the animosity that we see between generations that's oftentimes going on. It's hard to learn how to be an adult when the only adults in your lives are your teachers or your parents. Like, it's way better to just have a more mixed society. But that's my rant for now on how university is making the issue of extended adolescence much worse, how it's encouraging these kinds of behaviors, and also how some universities are acting completely antithetically to what education should be and are just bending to the will of the temper tantrums of young adults. And now I want to talk about the economic aspects of extended adolescence. First, going back to history, obviously with child labor and the Great Depression, there wasn't really a way for us to have an adolescent culture because everyone was just working or basically, you know, homeless and scrapping for a meal. There wasn't exactly a lot of time to let kids be kids or to have, you know, teenagehood as we have it. But the economic boom in 1945 after World War II helped give rise to this. Again, that's when the Teenage Bill of Rights was made, and a lot more young people were able to access automobiles and so on, which allowed them to start dating without adult supervision or anything like that, and just ultimately added to the independence and freedom of teenagers. But I think the biggest component of extended adolescence and the divide between people who stay young way past adulthood and people who never get that opportunity is due to economics. So when it comes to class differences and extended adolescence, it all begins with parenting styles. In general, middle and upper middle class parents parent a lot differently from working and lower class parents, and this plays a large role in why most of the people who we consider to be extended adolescents to be upper class. Whereas working class parents are more likely to engage in free-range parenting and are more likely to discipline their children when the children act out. Middle and upper class parents are more likely to engage in concerted cultivation, which is basically a more intensive style of parenting. Whereas in the 70s and along a lot of working class families, kids are generally allowed to roam around and hang out with their friends and just be away from the parents a lot more often. Upper class parents tend to put their kids in extracurricular activities such as sports or music lessons, or when they're older have SAT prep tutors and so on. And the main motivating factor behind this, and the biggest distinction we see in this parenting style, is between parents who have college degrees, which again are generally middle and upper class parents, and parents who don't have it. And a huge basis of concerted cultivation parenting is to prepare the child for college. And this is why middle and upper class Gen Z kids are generally overscheduled and overparented and have a lot less autonomous time to themselves. And I think this definitely also plays a role in the increase in poor mental health among Gen Z kids. And we also see this effect in more concrete terms. Middle and upper class Gen Z kids or teenagers are waiting a lot longer to get their first jobs. They're waiting a lot longer to get their driver's license, and are generally taking longer to take on adult responsibilities. And there's generally just a lot more focus on getting middle and upper middle class kids into university rather than preparing them for a working adult life. But despite the class differences in parenting, there are aspects of a poor economy that are affecting extended adolescence. As basically everyone knows and everyone can tell and everyone can see, a lot more adults are living with their parents, adults being people 18 to 30, and people overall are taking a lot longer to move out of their parents' house. And a big part of why this is the case is in a lot of places, probably most places, the cost of living exceeds the average income of adults. So it's becoming a lot more difficult to sustain yourself financially as an independent today as it was in recent history. There's also the issue of college tuition being insanely high right now, which makes it a very wise option for people whose parents will allow them to live with their parents and work and pay off those student loans before eventually getting their own place. And there's also the reality that a college degree today isn't worth as much as it used to because a lot more people have college degrees. I mentioned in my college and university experience video, when I graduated college, I went back to minimum wage work just like all of my friends did. Even in fields that were generally regarded as smart to get involved in, such as computer science and so on, are becoming less tenable because so many people are qualified for those kinds of jobs that a lot of people just can't find work even though they got a degree that they thought was going to help them find work. And so because of this, a lot of people with college degrees are still living with their parents because they can't get a sustainable job in their field. And then, of course, with this recent pandemic, it's rendering a lot of people unemployed, and a lot of people are moving back with their parents because of that. And again, I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with living with your parents when you're an adult, but I do think it definitely has an effect on extended adolescence. I know personally, when I moved back in with my parents after college, I felt like I was regressing to my high school self. Living with your parents is different than living with a random roommate because the child and parent dynamic has been there for so long that it's hard to just break it and treat each other as pure equals. And in general, even when you're an adult, it's likely that your parents are going to restrict your freedoms by asking where you are all the time or even setting a curfew because that's just been the dynamic from when you were a teenager. And it makes it a lot harder, in my personal experience, to function as an adult when you're living with your parents as an adult. I think this is also one of those circumstances where you really have to watch out for the best friend parent, because I think when you're a best friend parent and your kid moves back in with you, even when they're an adult, you just jump at that opportunity to make them codependent again and continue on with that codependent relationship that you established when they were a child. And I think it's especially hard for adults who have parents like that to leave those kinds of circumstances. And then other economic aspects of extended adolescence, it's no longer seen as smart or feasible to have a family when you're 20 years old, like you used to be able to back in the day. It seems like most 20-year-olds now aren't fully financially independent and are definitely not in a circumstance to be able to raise a family. And also the means of production in our society have shifted tremendously throughout history to where we don't sew our own clothes anymore, we don't farm our own food, we're completely dependent on the market in order to sustain ourselves. A lot of people don't even know how to cook these days. They just always order takeout. And if you're completely reliant on corporations and institutions in order to have a normal sense of life, I think this ultimately makes us a lot less self-reliant and breaks down some of our autonomy. And I'm not saying that I want to be, one of those cottagecore people who move out onto a dairy farm in Vermont and just sew my own clothes and everything. There are aspects of the modern world that I obviously enjoy, but I do think this reliance on the market does extend adolescence. And of course, this wouldn't be a commentary video in 2021 if I didn't talk about social media. So I think, as anyone can tell, Gen Z basically runs the internet. They run the internet when it comes to politics, when it comes to trends, when it comes to information, and so on and so forth. And this makes sense because Gen Z is the first generation to grow up completely online. A lot of people who were around before the internet haven't gone on the internet or on the internet much less frequently than children who grew up with it are. And I think Gen Z running most of the internet is part of the reason why cancel culture is so bad right now and why black and white thinking is often encouraged and why we only see extreme viewpoints on Twitter and so on. Part of this, of course, is due to the attention economy. The most radical ideas get the most attention because a lot of them are batshit crazy and it causes a lot of people to react to it. And I know a lot of grown-ass adults participate in cancel culture and get outraged at the pettiest things, and there are even politicians who utilize this to their advantage. But in general, I view cancel culture as sort of black and white thinking, which is most commonly found in children. I also view Twitter mobs as being, again, just basically a large temper tantrum, which I also associate with children. And something else I see a lot are people who take their interpersonal problems to social media to vent, the whole subtweet phenomenon, where instead of just talking to someone directly who you have an issue with, you bitch about it online in order to get attention. And to me, this is extremely annoying, and if you've seen it, you've seen it. But I think this is definitely an issue, again, of moral dependence, of being taught to always have an authority nearby to resort to in order to punish someone on your behalf. Whether it's tattling to a teacher that someone called you a bad name, or whether it's having a university admin bend to your will when you want someone fired for a very small reason. Taking interpersonal problems to social media is just another aspect of this. And ultimately, obviously, it's very petty and immature. Just talk to the person you have an issue with. Why are you venting it all on social media? But also, we live in a society where everyone shares all of their personal information online, no matter how banal or mundane, so I guess we really shouldn't be surprised that people are taking their petty issues to social media as well. Something else that I find very interesting that probably doesn't have a lot of political significance, but I just find fascinating, is the fact that it seems like nowadays adults want to be teenagers rather than teenagers wanting to be adults. So I'm of the Vine generation. You know, when I was in high school, Vine was like a huge thing. And before it got shut down, there was an app called Musical.ly that came out, which anyone above the age of 12 was very averse to. It's basically just kids lip syncing, and it's super cringy, and no one in their right mind, unless you're literally in middle school, would be on that app. And it was just understood that that's a thing for kids. You let them do their thing, so on and so forth. But now with TikTok coming out, and I know people are already tense because I'm like gonna go on a baby boomer rant about TikTok. But now with TikTok coming out, it seems a lot of adults are trying to emulate teenagers. And I understand that TikTok is more than just 15-year-olds dancing and like lip syncing to songs. I know some people do comedy skits on there. I have nothing against TikTok. I think some TikToks are really funny. And like I said, this may not have political significance, but I do notice a lot of adults copying TikTok aesthetics that are based in teenagers, like the whole two-toned hair with like half pink, half blue or whatever, and other trends that originate on TikTok amongst teenagers. The whole e-boy, e-girl thing seems to be being co-opted by older people. Like people in their 20s are trying to emulate these trends, and I just find it bizarre. It's like if I was a kid and I saw someone who was 25 or 27 trying to emulate the emo look and be emo, I would just be appalled. I'd be like, what are you doing? That's embarrassing. Like it's a thing for teenagers. But a lot of adults are trying to copy a teenage aesthetic. And again, I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with this. Cultures always bleed into each other. And so it makes sense for there to be some overlap between teenage and adult cultures in terms of aesthetics. But I also noticed lately, not just online, but adults in general wanting approval from teenagers, which I think is bizarre. Like I get it, everyone wants people to like them and all of that, but why do you care what teenagers think of you? Like just be a good person, set a good example, let them do their thing, you do your own thing. Eventually they'll, transition into adulthood and maybe you could be their friend. But in general, you shouldn't look to children or teenagers for approval. You should be confident enough in yourself to not need that. But it's something that I've seen a lot lately, and I just think it's totally bizarre. The other social media aspect I want to talk about is the recent phenomenon of adulting videos and adulting content. The term adulting spiked in 2016. I don't know if it just wasn't a term before then or if there's just a recent need for it. But basically, adulting videos are people in their 20s who explain on YouTube or on Instagram or wherever about how to do things like pay taxes, pay car insurance, get health insurance, and so on and so forth. And I know a lot of people cringe at the word adulting because it's kind of cringy, but I do think it's really interesting that there is a demand for these types of videos. And I watched some of those videos in order to do this video. And something I see constantly in those videos are the people expressing how upset they are that school didn't teach them these things, these basic life functions. And I think that's a very valid critique, and that's something that people should be upset about. That basically in high school we learn things that aren't practical to the neglect of learning about things that are practical, such as how to pay taxes, how to do car payments, how to pick out an insurance plan. All those basic adulting activities that we should know, we just aren't taught, and we're flung into the real world and have to learn it ourselves all at once instead of gradually like how it should be. I also want to mention pornography. This isn't something that I'm going to go into detail on because honestly I just haven't researched the effects of it enough, but I do know people are watching porn a lot more than they ever have before, specifically teenagers. And we've also seen that teenagers are waiting until longer to have sex. Most teenagers in the past few years do not lose their virginity in high school. They lose it later on, and that hasn't been the case before. And I know sex is like a taboo topic, and depending on your religion, you might not even be allowed to have it until you're married or whatever. But I generally view sex as basically one of the integral parts of growing up. It's one of the main things that separate children from adults, is being sexually active. And I think this increased use of pornography amongst teenagers is making them a lot more self-conscious about their bodies. It's making them more averse to sex. And I think it's ultimately impeding on the natural sexual progression of people, of teenagers. And I think that ultimately does have an effect on growing up. But again, I don't know a lot about this topic, but I do think it's worth mentioning. And then the next section ties into social media because it's something that I've seen on social media, and that's the recent stigmatization of age gap relationships. And so basically, if you're not aware, over the past couple years, there's been a lot of outrage on Twitter and other social media websites around age gap relationships and people calling them inherently predatory or abusive and so on. And this just generally has not been the case throughout history. It's very recent. And I definitely think it has a lot to do with extended adolescence because there's this current view that 20-year-old women or women in their early 20s aren't seen as adult and aren't seen as capable of making their own decisions, which is highly infantilizing and disingenuous. But it also goes hand in hand with adults wanting to be seen and treated as teenagers. I think the idea that a 20-year-old can't choose who they sleep with as long as the person's, above the age of consent is ridiculous. And this isn't to say that age gap relationships can't be abusive. They can, just like any relationship can. And I understand thinking it's creepy if someone's going after freshly minted 18-year-olds. I get that that is seen as creepy to most people. I personally wouldn't date someone like that. But the idea that someone who's 18 to 20 or 22 or whatever can't consent to sex with another adult, I also find that just highly infantilizing. And listen, age gap relationships aren't the norm. They aren't normal by any means. Most people don't engage in them, but some people do, and I don't think that that's wrong. Sometimes people who have an age disparity in their relationship just happen to fall in love and have a mutually fulfilling and beneficial relationship. One of the contradictions too when it comes to this recent online outrage around age gap relationships is that it often happens within the feminist movement, which in recent years has been ripe with contradictions. I'm eventually going to do a whole video on that. But one of these contradictions is the idea that if you're 18 years old and you have an OnlyFans and most of your clientele are 50-year-old men, then you're empowered and good for you, like girl power, whatever. Or if you're a sugar baby and you're 20 and your boyfriend is 40, then you're empowered and you go girl, go get that bag or whatever. But if you're 20 years old and you happen to have a healthy, consensual, happy relationship with someone who's 40, then you're being taken advantage of. It makes absolutely no sense. And I get it, our society likes to view everything as transactional. It's very unfeeling in that sense. But you can't claim that an 18-year-old is competent enough to be able to make an OnlyFans and make money off of sex appeal while appealing to older men, but at the same time is not capable of consenting to a healthy, regular relationship with someone older than them. The idea that a 20-year-old can't choose who they sleep with is also ridiculous, and the fact that, at least in my town, because I grew up in a very religious town, a lot of people when they're 20 literally get married and have children and are celebrated for it. And the idea that a 20-year-old can choose to get married and have children, but can't choose to have sex with a 30-year-old is crazy. Sometimes people just happen to have relationships with an age gap. It's not that big of a deal. But I think this recent outrage along age gap relationships has to do again with stratification of age. Because people are taking a lot longer to grow up, they like having the view that people who are 30 or 40 are fundamentally different from people who are in their 20s, particularly amongst 20-year-olds who want to be treated like they're teenagers. But this is just disingenuous and it's just blatantly untrue. But honestly, a big reason why this recent outrage upsets me is because it reminds me so much of homophobic discourse throughout the years. The idea that all gay men are pedophiles or predatory or abusing young men and so on and so forth. And the whole Christian idea that it's morally wrong for gays to be together. Basically what it comes down to is you're taking your own disgust and turning it into a moral issue. If you think two men who have sex is disgusting, then just believe that it's disgusting. Don't turn it into a moral issue like people have been constantly. Same with age gap relationships. If you think it's gross for a 20-year-old to fuck a 30-year-old or a 40-year-old or a 50-year-old or whatever, then just think it's gross. That's fine. You could think that. But turning it into a moral issue and saying all people in those relationships are being taken advantage of, or it's always a gold digger relationship, or that the older person involved is inherently predatory, it's just not true. And trying to change your own disgust to a moral argument is just so disingenuous. And obviously this idea of gay men being predators or pedophiles has lasted a lot longer than stigmatization of age gap relationships, and I imagine it'll probably last longer, unfortunately. Whereas with this age gap discourse, it's really only occurred over the past couple of years alongside the rise of extended adolescence. But in general, when you try to take your own disgust about something and turn it into a moral issue when a moral issue isn't there, I just think that's really fucked up because it's redirecting an argument to something that's way more theoretical than it really is. You just happen to think it's gross. Move on. I've also just never understood people who give a fuck at all of who people sleep with. Like, as long as you're both adults, it literally does not matter. I don't understand why people care. If you don't want to date someone older than you, then just don't. It's not that hard. Like, I don't understand this fake outrage, but it is something I've seen online a lot, and since it has to do with the video, I just wanted to throw it in. But now I'm going on to the next section. In this last part of the video, I want to talk about loss of innocence and how this separates childhood from adulthood, as well as how extended adolescence is basically an unnatural response to this of just trying to hold on to childhood when it's inevitable that it will just eventually dissipate. And of course, the idea of loss of innocence is not new at all. It's basically the overarching theme of literature and just humanity in general. Innocence refers to a state of unknowingness, of purity, of being unaware of the evils of yourself and of mankind. It's simple-mindedness and openness, a person who hasn't been fouled yet by society. And the main thing that separates an innocent person from a non-innocent person is gaining a sense of moral responsibility and understanding consequences for your actions. Children children have to develop a moral conscience over time. In general, toddlers are kind of sociopathic in that they'll just hit you or inflict pain or bully or be selfish because they don't understand that you're not supposed to do that. And this is why if a child, commits a crime, they're not held to the same accountability as if an adult does so, because an adult knows what they're doing. And so a natural part of becoming an adult is taking responsibility for your actions and shedding those narcissistic traits that children have. And I think a really common literary example that people know of is the Adam and Eve story, and I want to talk about how this relates to loss of innocence. Basically, the Adam and Eve story is where God has this paradise called Eden, and he creates Adam and creates Eve to live there and be stewards of the land. But he tells them not to eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which, as the name suggests, grants them the knowledge of good and evil. But they do this anyway, and when they do, they're aware of shame and guilt and just their human error. It's the original sin or the fall of man, and they're consequently banned from the Garden of Eden forever. And they're also aware of their nakedness, and they're ashamed and all of that, and eventually they go on to procreate. So there is, of course, a sexual element to that as well. But in general, loss of innocence is pretty strongly correlated with gaining a moral conscience and being aware of your actions and being able to sin or do the wrong thing. And of course, a lot of people think of sexuality when they think of loss of innocence. This is basically the main theme of every coming of age movie, is virginity and becoming a sexual being. And then the other aspect of loss of innocence is coming to terms with your own mortality and death. Another really popular book about this is Catcher in the Rye, where Holden Caulfield is obsessed with innocence and is unable to get past it and suffers a lot of emotional issues because of it. When the title of the book is referenced in the book, it's when his little sister is telling him that he has lyrics of the song wrong. In Holden's mind, it's a body catching a body in the rye, which is a very innocent interpretation, when the real quote is when a body meet a body running through the rye, which is a sexual reference. But throughout the entire book, Holden, in one hand, wants to lose his virginity, but on the other hand is unable to, even when he has all these opportunities. And it also grapples with death because he's really kind of not over the death of his kid brother Allie. And when Phoebe asks him to name one thing he likes, that's the only thing he can name is his kid brother. And the theme of innocence and loss of innocence and growing up is just basically the whole theme of the book. But that could be said for so many other books as well. And basically wanting to remain innocent when it's past your time is just going to lead to so much more anxiety and neuroses. Delaying your loss of innocence is just trying to remain ignorant, to be able to retain a childlike state where you're not responsible for your actions, where you don't have to deal with big existential questions. And it's basically a state of denial, because whether you like it or not, innocence is going to wear out for you. You are going to grow up. Because whether or not you like it, loss of innocence is coming. It's like trying to build a dam out of logs of a coursing river. Like, the river is going to eventually break through. And the longer that you are in denial of this, the more that you suffer. Eventually, you're going to have to be an adult whether or not you're ready. You're going to have to be able to pay rent. You're going to have to be able to work and contribute to society. You're going to have to be responsible for your friendships and relationships and the way that you act within them. Someone who tries to remain childlike and narcissistic and doesn't want to take responsibility for their actions are generally the type of people who will self-victimize themselves even when they're in the wrong, and are generally unable to deeply connect with others because they can't even deeply connect with themselves. They're just too focused on trying to push out reality. Whether you like it or not, you are getting older, you're getting closer to death every single day. Trying to stay in the cocoon-like state of childhood is just a losing battle, and it's best to just grapple with these aspects of humanity. And on one hand, I understand the kind of drive for extended adolescence. I understand if you're a parent wanting to allow your child to experience childhood for longer than you were able to. During World War II, a lot of teenagers were shipped off to war, and I think that's a large reason why right afterwards teenagehood was invented and people were living within adolescence for longer, because they had just witnessed the horrors of war and didn't want that for future generations. And we also, as a human species, just inherently want to protect children and protect their innocence. And it's because we know that it doesn't last forever. In a way, people live vicariously through their children. They're able to re-experience a sense of their own innocence that they had once lost through their child. But also, children inevitably grow up. And I think the best friend parent that I keep mentioning is one of the types of people that have the biggest struggle with this, because those types of people never wanted to give up their own innocence. That's why they can't even establish themselves as a healthy adult to their child. They just want to be seen as an equal instead of being a responsible adult. And when that kid leaves the nest and they have the whole empty house thing, I think that could be very traumatic for these people, because all of a sudden they're forced to deal with loss of innocence when they've been pushing it off their entire adult lives. And not only do you witness your child's loss of innocence when they grow up and leave the house, but also loss of innocence is an ongoing process throughout our entire lives. It's not like you turn 20 and all of a sudden, you have nothing left to learn. You've already been through all the hard stuff you ever will. You've already grappled and come to terms with your own mortality and everyone else's around you. It's just not like that. People go through divorce, they go through horrible losses, they go through traumatic experiences. And while a lot of kids are grown up in traumatic households or experience death, it is experienced in a different way, because when you're a kid and something horrible happens, let's say you're a kid and someone close to you dies, yes, you understand that they're not there anymore, but you're not grappling with your own mortality in that situation because you're just a kid and you don't really feel like you're gonna die. But one of the other big events most people face is when both of their parents are dead, because then that means you're next in line. And I think a lot of times when people look into a baby's face and feel that feeling of joy, I think that's a relief that you're distracted from your own mortality for a little while. Because the main biological and evolutionary urge for having children is to continue on the bloodline of the human race. And so when you see a young child, it's like a sense of relief, because it's almost like for a second you feel like you're not gonna die because there's someone to carry it on. But then eventually, of course, you realize that those kids are there to replace you. Those kids exist because you're gonna die soon, and those kids are gonna have kids, and that means that they're gonna die soon. And you just really can't escape death no matter how hard you try. And I know a lot of people view this whole loss of innocence thing and grappling with death as a negative thing. I mean, that's why a lot of people want to stay childlike forever, but I personally don't view it as a bad thing. I'm generally pretty grateful for it. I think that gaining responsibility for yourself and your life and your actions gives you a greater sense of meaning and depth than you can ever have as a child, because you're able to just kind of guide your life based on what you want. And you can also connect with others on a much deeper level because you've actually grappled with deeper things. I personally enjoy being an adult and feeling generally responsible for my life. I like knowing that my mistakes are my own doing, that I don't have to blame anyone else for them, that I'm able to learn and grow and experience things way more wholly than you can as a kid. And sure, it comes with its fair share of anxiety and all of that, but in general, I don't have much of an issue when it comes to getting older or becoming an adult. And I think if more people just accepted that throughout life things change, the way you feel changes, there are certain beliefs and ideas that you have that when you lose them will never come back. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just a part of growing up, and the more experience that you have, the better you could connect with others. And even if you're not digging the whole optimistic ending to this video, just know that loss of innocence and growing up and becoming an adult is inevitable. You can only hold it off for so long, and the longer that you do, the worse off you're gonna be. But in general, I feel like extended adolescence just really increases people's anxiety because they're trying so hard to prevent something that's naturally gonna happen anyway. And the fact that we don't prepare children for adulthood from a younger age and more gradually is a real shame. But anyways, that's my video on extended adolescence. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. If you made it to the end, wow, thank you, that's awesome. Leave a comment if you would like, anything that's on your mind. Subscribe to my channel if you want to see more content, and I will see you guys next time.